Welcome everybody to conversation number 74. We're going to be talking today about SEO testing, what it is, what you might care, and how its lessons can inform us with Will Critchlow. Thank you so much, Will, for being here. First time on the TLC. We're really happy to have you. Will is the founder and CEO at Search Pilot, the enterprise SEO testing software company that helps large websites test ideas for their impact on organic search performance. Search Pilot spun out of another SEO agency, Distilled, in early 2020, and Will co-founded that as well in 2005. Will, thank you so much for being here. Before I pass the baton, so to speak, over to you, I want to take a moment to thank our sponsors. Conductrix sponsors our TLC Slack, which allows us to have that wonderful search history. So we can all go over into the Slack and read all of, the years of history and all that content. It's full of great stuff. So thank you, Conductrix, Matt, Ezekiel, Nate, Ashley. Thank you so much. We love you. And Eppo and Chameleon are our TLC newsletter sponsors. Our next TLC newsletter comes out next week. So thank you so much, Eppo, Chameleon. We couldn't do it without you. I am going to stop share and pass it over to you and take it away, Will.
Thank you, Kelly. And hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's great to see lots of new faces, a couple of folks I do know, and thank you for joining. I'm hoping that I can make this interesting for a community that is focused on the slightly different angle to my specialism. As Kelly said, I come very much from the SEO background into experimentation later, where it's kind of funny to me. I think I'm right in saying that SEO kind of predates a lot of kind of conversion rate testing, but SEO testing came after conversion rate testing. So kind of from the very early days of conversion rate work, it was embedded with testing was part of it from the beginning, pretty much. And it's kind of always been that way. Whereas that's not been the case in SEO. SEO kind of started in the 90s. I got into it late 90s, early 2000s. And
can't see your screen yet.
That's okay.
Okay.
I'm about to do the screen share. Yeah, just the context of saying that it's slightly weird. I think it's kind of a historical accident that this kind of SEO being in a sense an older industry, but later into experimentation, which has led me to be here. So if I get anything wrong about the things you all know about, please correct me gently. I am here to learn. I'm keen to learn. I actually put a question into the Slack earlier this morning, so I'm looking forward to hearing more of all of your expertise, and I'm hoping I can be interesting to all of you as well. So let's go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully I now can't see all of you. I can never quite work out how to oh, there we go. Good. So can I just get a thumbs up? Can you see the screen now? All set. All right, let's dive into this. So SEO testing, what it is, why you might care, and what we can learn. Where I'm actually going to start is with my experience as a consultant. So now I'm running Search Pilot, which is very much a software company. But as Kelly mentioned, I started in agency world. So I was a consultant and working with clients. And I would often have these conversations where we would be recommending some change. We thought an enhancement, so some kind of improvement in our eyes to the client's website designed to help them do better in SEO terms. And quite often the conversation would turn to, is this change going to hurt the conversion rate of the website? And obviously we took this very seriously. It was a very big deal. And there's a lot of thinking that went into this, but this conversation came up a lot. The other way around basically never did. This concept that the work that the conversion rate folks were doing, the user experience folks were doing, the tests that they might be running to see which version users preferred, users might pick the version that Google liked less. That was a thing that really, I genuinely, in 15 years of consulting, I don't think that conversation ever came up. and except when we started it. And it was, whereas the other way around came up all the time. And so this has been something that has been fascinating to me for years. And it's not just hypothetical. So what we're doing these days is we're trying to bring scientific experimentation to SEO. As I said, that's not something that's always been a thing. But so we're trying to create charts that look something like this. And you've all seen charts that come out of the tools that you all use that go up and to the right, right? And have some kind of confidence band on them. So you've seen this kind of thing. But this is novel in SEO. And we've been working on this now for a good few years, but historically, this has not been possible, but it is now. Controlled SEO tests are possible. So that's, I guess, lesson one. It is possible, at least, to run these kind of tests. Lesson two is this is the SEO result of a winning conversion rate test. So this was someone we worked with who ran a conversion rate experiment based off good user research and found a higher conversion rate for their hypothesis. And we said, well, can we test this before you roll it out fully? Can we just check that what Google's going to think about this? And the answer of what Google thought was minus 25% organic traffic. This is on product detail pages, PDP in e-commerce. So huge deal, an incredibly big source of organic traffic for this particular website. And we'll get into how these conflicts can arise, why this actually can still happen. But the main thing is just like, shock, this is not just a theoretical problem. Let's back up a little bit and just talk about how SEO testing works for a second. I'm assuming everyone here is familiar with the kind of what you all might just call A/B testing, conversion rate testing, user experience testing, CRO testing, has all of these kind of names. So I'm kind of starting from that idea that if you, in traditional A/B testing, each landing page that you wanted to test on, the page would have two variants. So the idea, and this is super simplified in both cases, obviously multi-armed bandit stuff is possible. The simple explanation though is you can have multiple versions of a page and you split the audience. And I don't imagine I'm teaching anybody anything here when you randomly group some of your users to get the control and some of your users get the variant experience. And then you run the statistics to figure out which experience is better. And I'm not going to get deep into the differences between A/B testing, split testing, all that kind of stuff. The implementation doesn't matter for the purposes of this. The main point is each page has two variants and users get variant A or variant B. With SEO testing, that methodology doesn't work fundamentally because Google, and I saw the comment in Slack, and Bing and any other search engine that you care to optimize for, each search engine is effectively one user in this mindset. So when Googlebot visits your website, it's that user that you're kind of trying to impress, if you like, with the test. And so you can't, and it very much, Google is not a fan of you having multiple pages, multiple variations of each page on different URLs. So what we do instead of splitting the audience is we split the pages. And the kind of tests that we run work only really on large websites. So we work with travel, real estate, I already mentioned e-commerce, jobs, listings, websites, those kinds of, the example here is obviously a travel site with flight destinations. And so you wouldn't typically run this on a 4-page website. This would be thousands of pages. And instead of randomly splitting the audience, we're randomly splitting the pages. This comes with some statistical challenges. The distribution of pages is not the same as distributions of users, and there's some fun statistics that we can get into maybe another day. But the fundamental idea is somewhat similar. It's just that instead of splitting the, as I say, instead of splitting the audience, we're splitting the pages. So we go ahead and we do that. And we take what we call a site section, which is a group of pages that have a similar page template. So that could be PLP, PDP, could be destinations, locations, any of that kind of structure. We split some into the control, some into the variant, and the variant pages get the treatment applied. Hopefully this is fairly familiar, even though it's a slightly different methodology. And what this then means is that we can we make the change. So in this case, this is a page title change. So we're adding the price to the title of the page with the intention that that will show up in the search results. And we're hoping get a better click-through rate, maybe rank differently, and hopefully more visitors will come and visit that page as a result of this hypothesis and this change that we've made. We will detect that because we've got some control pages that are staying unchanged. I'm going to have time for questions at the end of the talk as a whole. If there's anything burning that isn't making sense or that you don't understand, please do speak up. And I'm trying to keep track of the various different places that might happen, but I'm sure Kelly can help with the moderation as well. So if I'm not making sense, speak up. If you've just got general curiosity questions, then we'll do a whole load of them at the end. So this is fundamentally what's going on. And the way that there's one other kind of key difference, I think, versus some conversion rate tests. And I know there are different ways of implementing conversion rate testing, but ours basically all happen server side. And so what we have is we have the user to the website. Typically, there's a CDN in place, a content delivery network, right? Most of our customers are working with Akamai or Cloudflare or Fastly. And what happens is that instead of in a normal workflow, the request going from the CDN to the website's so-called origin server, right? Where the website is hosted, is that we're sitting in between making changes. And so we sit inside the CDN, but we can make changes outside the origin. And what that means is that these changes are, because they're inside the CDN, they are completely server-side. And the important thing here is it's for a different reason than you might run a server-side conversion rate test. It has those benefits as well, but it crucially means that Google doesn't have to execute the JavaScript. And we'll talk a little bit more later on about the interesting ability in some situations of search engines to execute JavaScript after they crawl, but there's a lot of good reasons why you wouldn't want them to have to do that for the test. And so the crucial thing is no JavaScript dependencies. We can run even on websites where there is JavaScript going on, but we want to make a server-side change as well. And the crucial thing here as well that we'll get into in a minute is that it means that we can be doing SEO testing and user testing potentially even simultaneously, and we'll get into that. Now, as I said at the outset, this is not the way that SEO has historically been done. Most SEO teams are still lower down the hierarchy of maturity when it comes to evidence-based thinking. And I say this as a long-time SEO practitioner. I got into the industry officially in 2005, but even before that, and it's frustrating to practitioners, never mind to clients and bosses and executives, that SEO is still this mix of best practices, hunches, anecdotal evidence, and what the industry sometimes calls tests, which are typically uncontrolled tests. They're typically before and after, or kind of more like laboratory tests to see if Google is going to pick up certain changes that you might make. And so it's kind of a new approach that we're trying to think about here, but we didn't invent it. It has been probably pioneered, I think, at a number of the big tech companies who have the kind of resources where they can throw engineers and data scientists at these kind of problems. So we know Pinterest did it early. We know that folks like TripAdvisor have been doing this for many years, and these days a lot of those big tech platforms are doing it themselves as well. So it's not completely new, but it is relatively rare in SEO. And so I'm hoping that's something that makes it interesting to all of you as well. Okay, a diversion away from testing for a second, just to think about where I started. How is it that there can be versions of your website that users prefer that Google does not prefer? Why can there be changes that fit into that mold? If you just listen to what Google spokespeople say, and you read the information that Google puts out there about how to perform well in organic search, you'll hear a lot of Google cares about users. They'll even go as far as to say, you don't need to think about search engines, just do what's right for your users, which I'm sure to this community is music to your ears. This is what you want to hear. It's like, if we just do the right thing for our users, then everything else is going to hang together. And unfortunately, it's more of a, I guess it's closer to a mission statement. It's what they'd like to eventually be true versus a hard and fast rule right now. Here's some ways I like to think about this. So I talk about user experience is a ranking factor. And this is somewhat controversial in my world, in SEO. Less so these days, actually, because there's been Google for a long time muddied this water in a variety of ways, but there's been some quite interesting information that's come out of some of the antitrust cases, which I'm not going to get deep into. I'm no lawyer, but that ends up opening up to the public a lot of internal communications that previously were hidden away within Google. And some of it has confirmed things that people have suspected for many years. But anyway, point being, user experience, in my opinion, is a ranking factor. And what do I mean by that? All these words can be somewhat, you can argue about what they mean. So what do I mean? I mean user experience, by which I mean how users see your site, is a ranking factor, by which I mean affects organic search performance. Now, you can argue about the semantics here, but I think most people agree in broad brushstrokes with this kind of thinking. It's crucial, though, firstly, to realize it's only one ranking factor. There are other ranking factors, and some of those are much more technical. Some of those users don't even see. And so it's not quite as simple as we might have hoped. So yeah, you might hope that we could be on a beach thinking, I don't know why we'd be on a beach. You might hope we could just do the user experience optimization, just think about the users alone. But for folks as old as me, we get out the Dikembe Mutombo finger and say, no, it doesn't quite work like that. Google makes mistakes is the first part of it. It's not, even though this is directionally what they would like to be true, they don't have a perfect way of measuring user experience. And the proxies are not always perfect. And it's just a really complicated thing. You know, anybody who's ever run any kind of testing, whether it be SEO testing or user experience testing or any other form, humans are complicated. So I'm not holding this against them. This is no criticism. It's just that things can go wrong. A couple of little anecdotes that I quite enjoyed. The first one is this, both of these men are actually now Googlers, though at the time, so this is Paul Ha on the left, talking to Danny Sullivan on the right. At the time of this interview, Danny didn't work for Google. Danny was a journalist. He had his own website called Search Engine Land. He's now inside Google, talking to the Borg. He'd hate me for saying that. But Paul Ha has worked for Google for many, many years. And this was an interview where Ha talked about how they evaluate improvements or hypotheses of the Google search algorithm itself. So when the Google search engineers come forward and say, hey boss, I've got this great idea. I think if we tweak our algorithm in this way, our search results will be better. They will impress more users, more folks will click on the right links, they'll find the information they're looking for, and so forth. And one of the ways that they did this for some time was what they call next page click rate. In other words, a good improvement to a Google algorithm, in Google's opinion at the time, was it reduces the number of people who go on to page 2 of the search results. So if you can serve what they need on page 1, the user scrolls down page 1, finds what they need, they'll be less likely to go and look on page 2. And so when you're testing a hypothesis, so the search engineer comes along, has that hypothesis, you test it and you say, do more people go to page 2 or fewer people go to page 2 as a result of this change? And in a classic example of a good measure making a good metric making a bad measure, or the other way around, I can remember that saying, this was eminently gameable by Google engineers. One of the things they discovered was that if they just put a load of white space at the bottom of their search results page, then fewer people click on page 2. If you just make it harder to get to page 2, then that improved their score on their algorithm. And I don't think they shipped that, obviously, but it just shows that anytime you're not measuring the thing you actually care about, anytime you're measuring a proxy or you're measuring something that you hope is indicative or correlated with the thing you want, it's open to failure and potentially even gaming and so forth. So that's part of it. Another example that I quite enjoyed was that they had one experiment that took them some time to debug, where what they used to do was randomly flip search rankings to see how users behaved. So the experiment, this is another quote from Ha. He said they had a long-running experiment where they swapped results 2 and 4. So if you imagine the top 4 results for a search query, some users would be served a different ordering of these top 4 results, where positions 2 and positions 4 were switched. Okay? And they ran this as a kind of almost like a holdout group, right? As a kind of sense check on all of the other work that they're doing. Because what they're essentially saying is, if we're doing our job correctly as Google and we're making our search results better and better and better over time, the flipped results will be worse, right? Because what we've done is we've taken, we correctly put them in orders 1, 2, 3, 4, and now we've said, well, the 4th result is going to be where the 2nd result used to be. So that we've moved a worse result up the page and a good result down the page. And they said, yeah, we're going to have this long-term holdout group that gets these flipped just to make sure that we're right, that these positions 2 and 4 are the correct way around. And they said they had this hypothesis that if you did this, you'd get more clicks on the 3rd result, right? Position 1 hasn't changed. Number 1 is unchanged. You've now got a worse result in the 2nd position because that's what used to be position 4. So more people are going to click on this 3rd result, which now seems better in context, right? That's the hypothesis. That is not, in fact, what happened. What happened was more people clicked on position 1, which hasn't changed. And you can kind of guess how this came about, because it's a little bit like that old joke about not having to outrun the bear, you only have to outrun the person you're with. The position 1 was basically looking better because the result directly below it was now worse. And people weren't even reading as far as position 3. They were just going, oh, I'm 1's okay, 2's no good, let's click on 1. Point being, you can have a very strong hypothesis and it can be right for the wrong reasons, wrong for the right reasons. And all of this stuff is just pointing to the complexity of Google's job, where they're trying to optimize kind of by proxy, right? They want to send you to the right websites. They don't control those websites. They're trying to control their own search rankings. So this is how all of these things come up. If you want to get this stuff from the horse's mouth, there's a YouTube video of this interview that we can share the slides on the Slack channel afterwards, and you can click through at your leisure and listen to this interview and see more about it. But anyway, the point being, coming back to what am I trying to get at here? What I'm trying to get at is, unfortunately, or fortunately for me, because it partly keeps me in a job, there can be differences between the best thing for Google and the best thing for users. And those differences might disappear over time, they might converge over time, but it's not guaranteed that a winning conversion rate test is going to be a winning change for Google. So this led us to thinking, okay, what we really want to do, going right back, you remember those first slides I had, where it's like, we had a winning conversion rate test that was a catastrophically bad SEO test. Can we think about this in a more holistic way? And what we've called this is full funnel analysis. So if you take a conversion rate test, you're essentially trying to make the bottom of the funnel wider, right? So it doesn't change how much comes in the top. You just want a greater percentage to go through and give you money. A pure SEO test is just trying to increase the top of the funnel. It's just trying to say, let's have more people come in and the same ratio of those people converting to business. And whereas a full funnel test is saying, let's think about all of this holistically. Can we think about not only the ratio of people that convert, but the number of people that convert, which is affected both by the conversion rate and by the amount of new visitors that you get into the site. And this is the philosophy, and it's based on, I think, just what feels to me like a fairly straightforward realization that our two disciplines are not actually disjoint, right? They're shockingly siloed. Most of the brands that I've ever worked with, these are two different teams. Often they don't even report to the same people. Increasingly, SEO is getting moved into the product team. So actually, there is some convergence there as well. But I think there's a huge amount of overlap between SEO and CRO. For not everything. There are some things that are really just SEO. I think if you're talking about meta information on the page that is not even visible to the user, that's unlikely probably to affect conversion rate. It's just not seen by humans. And conversely, there's stuff that you all do that Google never sees, right? If you think about logged in experiences. Think about something deep within the checkout funnel of an e-commerce site where only logged in users see it. Google has no view on that, so that's not going to affect rankings. But basically everything else, everything that is seen by both Google and users, like, could affect either, right? And so we've now seen this quite a lot. We've run experiments where we have uplifts in both areas and then a combined uplift that we can put together. And I guess this is probably the most zoomed out lesson that I'm kind of trying to convey today, is just to say, I think there should be so much more collaboration between the disciplines. There should be a lot more sharing of hypotheses, sharing of data, sharing of learnings, strategies, tactics, all this kind of stuff. And that's kind of partly why I'm here in the community, and I'm learning. As I said, I put a question in into Slack earlier today because I want to learn from the experience that your industry has been developing for years, and hopefully I have something to offer in return. So before we get to the final bit, where I figured we'd take some questions, I thought it's often interesting in these kind of things, especially when I'm talking to folks who aren't SEO professionals necessarily all themselves, just to talk about some actual tests that we've run, right? We all know, you know better than anyone, that tests don't always generalize. You can't just take a test and assume it's going to work the same way on a different website or in a different industry or whatever else. But nonetheless, they're interesting, I think. I certainly find it interesting to look at things that have been winners and losers. And the first one I pulled up was I said right at the outset about JavaScript. I know there's a question in Slack, apparently a joke question about Bing. I am guilty often of just talking about Google, but in particular in this case, Google, specifically Google, has been getting quite good at executing JavaScript. And the Google bot is now essentially headless Chrome for anybody who understands what the heck I'm talking about there. If you're not into that side of things, the main thing you need to know is, broadly speaking, Google can execute a lot of JavaScript, but it is expensive. It is so much more expensive to render a page than it is just to crawl it and index it. And this extra step can have delays, brittleness, ways it can break, and in some cases, they will even just not run the JavaScript to save, we think, to save resources. So it's improving, but it's not perfect. This is actually an example where we've got tests in all the directions. So we've had tests where the JavaScript, we tested removing a JavaScript dependency and got an uplift. So in other words, the website performed better in Google without the JavaScript dependency. We've had completely neutral results that we were really hopeful were going to be beneficial. Pre-rendering is one of these kind of, expensive things that many websites feel they had to do. We wanted to prove that they didn't need to, and unfortunately that test came out completely inconclusive. We could prove no benefit in either direction. And we've even seen positive tests of adding JavaScript helping site performance. This is actually a case, I think, where the user experience was correlated with the SEO performance, because it basically was just such a better user experience that even though it was implemented in JavaScript, it resulted in a ranking boost and a performance boost. But the lesson that I take away from this, at least, is our tests themselves need to be run server-side. The test itself can't be run in JavaScript, because otherwise every single thing you run, you're testing two hypotheses. You're testing the hypothesis you're trying to test and a separate hypothesis that Google can actually understand and interpret this JavaScript correctly. And we've got some evidence, we've got some research coming out soon, actually. We've got some evidence coming that suggests this is actually a particular problem for tests implemented in JavaScript, because, as I say, Google is looking for ways that they can save money and optimize and only run the bits of JavaScript they need to run. And in trying to not run things like analytics code and other similar things, it looks quite likely that they essentially will try and ignore any tests implemented in JavaScript. Okay, a few other examples. One that we're going to be in alignment on is that we have seen cases where we've taken essentially pure user experience hypotheses and seen them be beneficial for search. So actually, this was a case where the hypothesis was that it would make no difference if we put a whacking great interstitial email sign up pop-up in front of users. Not no difference to user experience. The hypothesis was that this would make no difference to SEO performance. And in fact, it caused a drop in SEO performance, never mind conversion rate. And so this is an example where, and you must have this kind of tension as well on your side where, conversion rate and user experience are not exactly the same thing, right? So a kind of intrusive interstitial email sign up form might generate more conversions, but might make your users less happy, conceivably. Anyway, in this particular case, it turned out that that kind of intrusive pop-up made Google less happy as well. One of my favorite tests, just because we've replicated this on many different sites in many different scenarios over the years, and yet it's one of those things that Google's official line is this doesn't matter, is hidden text. So not hidden in the sense of anybody who's in SEO in the 90s, kind of white text on a white background hidden off the side of the screen. I mean, hidden in the sense of like normal user experience, user interface methodologies like accordions, tabs, anything like that, where you literally can't just scroll and see the content. And particularly on mobile with a limited screen size, this kind of stuff is very common. We have repeatedly seen that taking content out of tabs or accordions or any of this kind of thing, taking it out of that and making it just straight away visible on the page, so just a long form scroll page, results in significant uplifts. And as I say, that is one that has consistently replicated across different sites. An example of something that is nowhere near conversion rate is showing tests where the hypothesis is related to how the site is going to show up in Google itself, right? We call it the search engine results page. So this is the used to be the 10 blue links, right? You do your search and you get the list of websites that you could conceivably click on. And we call this the snippet, is the text that is displayed that gives you a kind of sense of what this page is going to be about when you go and visit it. And this particular test was, again, quite a fun one where we were trying to force Google to use our meta description instead of, as they were previously doing, extracting information using their own machine learning algorithms from the page itself. And this was a negative test. So it turned out, in fact, that Google was writing better meta descriptions than we were, which is always one of those sad things to discover when you're a well-meaning professional who's been in this industry for many years. You can extrapolate. It's not just things like meta descriptions that show up in the search results. It's things like structured data can as well. I haven't been able to reproduce this screenshot. I took this screenshot years ago, and it's just spectacular, isn't it? This has got, what have we got here? We've got breadcrumbs, we've got star ratings, we've got average ratings, review markup, price markup, and FAQ, kind of embedded FAQ dropdowns. You don't tend to see results quite as rich as this these days, but this is quite a spectacular one. Anyway, the general lesson there is new forms of structured markup that give you access to new kinds of search listing enhancements often pay off. There is a benefit to novelty, and it doesn't always last because your competitors eventually roll out the same markup that you're using. But essentially, anytime Google launches or releases new forms of search enhancements, rich snippets, it's worth giving them a try because you'll often get a boost in the short term just because you look different to the rest of the search results. And again, that's click-through rate improvement often rather than a ranking improvement. And I don't have time to get deep into that today, but just a brief mention that we've been doing some quite interesting, if anybody's interested in this, you can drop me a line on Twitter or somewhere. I can share some other resources, is Slack, I guess would be the obvious place, where we've been doing some research both on how Googlebot crawls these tests. So that's magic. How did I get a thumbs up just then? Weird new Mac thing, I think. Yeah, Googlebot crawl data. And specifically for this kind of analysis, we've also been pulling in Google Search Console data. So I don't know if anybody who has less SEO experience may not have has as much exposure to it, but Google Search Console is essentially the place where you get all of the data that Google is prepared to give you about how your site shows up in search results, where you rank, what keywords you rank for, what kind of search enhancements you have present, all that kind of stuff. And there's an API. So we've been pulling some of that data into our analysis And what that's useful for is less for detecting whether something is a good idea or not, and more for explaining SEO test results. So you can imagine that a winning SEO test could have won for a variety of reasons. It's not just as simple as conversion rate, which is essentially just one number divided by another. The search traffic can increase because you're now ranking for new keywords that you didn't used to rank for. You're ranking better for things that you always ranked for, and or your click-through rate has improved. In other words, even if you haven't ranked for anything new or improved any of your rankings, you've got a more compelling search snippet for whatever reason, and your click-through rate has improved rather. And yeah, so what we're trying to do with that data is get better at the explanation piece and being able to say, look, this particular test was a winner because it was a ranking improvement or because it was a click-through rate improvement. The data can be quite noisy, but that's the objective, at least. Keen to get on some questions. I can see that there have been some coming up in the Slack, so we'll flip over to that very shortly. Final couple of points I was just going to make. This is probably heading into SEO geekery, so this is more if we've got any SEO folks in the room. We do run internal linking tests as well. They're kind of fun, but they're complex to run and complex to analyze. So that's one where I've got this whole separate thing about it. So again, the link will be in the slides, which we'll share in the Slack, and you can check out how to do that. The very brief summary of why it's difficult is that when you change how your internal linking structure works, the effect can be felt not just on the pages you change, but on the pages that are getting or receiving new links or that have lost links or whatever else. So the analysis can be a little difficult, and we run what we call a test section and an analysis section, and those do not have to necessarily be the same set of pages. So that's kind of fun. And there's a whole load more of these. So if you have enjoyed if like me, you like reading about specific test results, we've got tons of them on the website, and you can head over to searchpilot.com and see literally a backlog of dozens and dozens of these things, hundreds of these things actually. And if you go to searchpilot.com/newsletter, you can get them in your inbox every other week. We publish a new one as well. So that's what I wanted to cover today, fundamentally. Hopefully I've set us up some interesting discussions and conversations. I'm going to throw it a little bit open to the floor, so feel free. Should we do Slack questions first?
Yes, absolutely. Let's start. Our first question is from Justin in Sminger. He asks, what happens if Google likes your new variant page, example, price for Madrid example, but conversion declines for those visitors? Is there a pretty extensive decision matrix thought out prior to new SEO experiment that covers all aspects, assuming here, and respective metrics?
Great question, Justin. So my approach, sometimes we built out some of that decision matrix, but actually more often what we're looking at is a more of an iterative approach. So generally, if there is this trade-off between user experience or user preference and Google preference, we want to try and understand what's going on and actually see if we can get the best of both worlds. So that very first example I showed, the winning conversion rate test that was a negative SEO test, what we actually did in that instance, that if I remember correctly, that was about removing a load of text on category pages, PLPs, for an e-commerce site. And the users were happy that they were getting to the products quicker, right? It was, you get to the list of actual products straight away instead of that paragraph of copy that's like always a little bit awkward. But Google said, well, but we don't really know what the category page is about quite so much anymore. And so what we then tested was just moving that copy around the page and trying to get the best of both worlds, which we eventually managed to do, where the ranking stayed consistent, but the conversion rate benefits improved because that copy appeared lower down the page. So people were still getting to the products that they wanted quicker. That's not always possible, but I think that's my primary thinking, rather than having some complicated trade-off of like, if this, then that, will do, in this scenario, we'll do this, in this scenario, we'll do that. It's more like, if, obviously, if it's simple, if one is inconclusive and one is positive, then great, let's carry on. If they're opposite to one another, let's try and understand what's going on. It is possible to do some of the trade-off analysis, but it's not just as simple as comparing the percentages, because we have to remember this is an area where we're subservient to the CRO game, is conversion rate applies to all visitors, whereas search is only some subset of visitors. So even if search has gone up 20%, if conversion rate is harmed, the conversion rate is harmed not only for search visitors, but for potentially all visitors. So yeah, it does depend. It is possible to build out some kind of decision rules about, and I think probably that's about if things are, it's easiest, obviously, in the cases where everything is either aligned or one or other test is not negative, inconclusive at worst.
That makes sense.
And yeah, when there is conflict, we kind of try and understand it, and it guides future testing sometimes. So you might hold off releasing that until you can iterate a little bit. I've got the Slack open now, so yeah, happy for you to pick questions out, Jill, but I can see it as well.
Okay. How do you control visitor distribution in SEO experiments since practitioners are relying on the SERP?
Yeah, so this, I think what you're getting at here, Justin, is a little bit like we talk a lot about sample rate mismatch in conversion rate testing, right? That kind of idea that your buckets can end up unbalanced. If I've got the wrong end of the stick, then shout. But this is what I was alluding to at the beginning when I said that some of the statistics is a little different, and we take a slightly different approach. And part of it is because we can't completely guarantee the same kind of randomization for all the reasons that you're talking about. It's worth remembering that we're judging pages, not users. And so it is possible basically to build statistical models that take account of this. And but what we try and do to mitigate it is we try and build buckets of pages. So remember, we've got this site section and we're splitting the site section in two. We're trying to create two groups of pages that are as statistically similar at the outset of the test as possible, looking at things like total traffic levels, average traffic levels, seasonality, variance of those, covariance, so kind of correlation, autocorrelation between the pages. And we found that the better we do at that, the more robust and sensitive the tests can be. And so, yeah, we can't control the visitor distribution, but equally, we don't need to be able to run the pure SEO test. Now, there is an interesting caveat to this, and we tried for many years to try and build a simultaneous test for both. So our early attempts at full funnel testing ran an SEO test and then tried to analyze it as both an SEO test and a conversion rate test. And actually what we found is because of this exact problem, you essentially can't quite do that. And so our full funnel tests are simultaneous conversion rate test, which is genuinely randomizing users, and SEO test, which is randomizing pages. And I say simultaneous, typically actually subsequent. We typically actually run one and then the other, but you can split up the site section and run them simultaneously, conceivably. Hopefully that helps with that. Do you want me to just keep going, Kelly?
Sure.
Cool. So if anybody else isn't in the Slack, the next question is Oliver asking, do you have to run multiple geos for this to work? A crawler from Google can only rank one version of the page. So yeah, this is right at the key difference, Oliver. Going right back to, let me pull up my slide. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Google can only rank one version of each page. And so we don't create duplicate variations of a page. In a pure SEO test, any given page only has one URL, one variation. Each page is either a control page or a variant page. And that is true for both the users and for Google. So in this example here, this page, can you see my cursor on here?
Yes.
Yeah. So if you're running a conversion rate test, you'd have two versions of the page, and either it would be you'd serve a different version of that page, or you'd send the user to a different URL, depending on whether you're running an A/B test or a split test. But in SEO testing, there's no difference in that concept. So this page is a control page, never changes. This page is a variant page, is always a variant page for all users, for Google and for human visitors, if that makes sense. So good. There was another question. TLC logo. Kelly has you. Oh yeah, I see. I understand that this is you acknowledging testing. Okay, full funnel testing. What to focus on to understand the overall conversion. So it's a question from Brianna. With full funnel testing, do I have examples of what to focus on to understand the overall conversion? So I don't know if I'm quite understanding this question correctly. If you dive into the thread, Brianna, you can add a bit of context or flesh this out for me a little bit. What we're kind of fundamentally trying to do, let me see if this answers your question, is we want to measure both impacts separately. So imagine a hypothesis, like I mentioned before, imagine a hypothesis that our subcategory pages would be better with less text on them, right? Just a list of products, no text. That's our hypothesis. We think they'd be better. We think they'd be better for users. And because they're better for users, maybe they'd be better for Google as well. And what we'd be measuring is on the SEO side, we'd be saying, do the pages that have text on them perform better or worse than the pages that don't have text on them, on average, obviously across a large sample set. And the conversion rate test would be just the kind of conversion rate test you're normally used to. So what percentage of the visitors to that page end up buying something? And obviously you can get more advanced with average order value and repeat purchases and so on and so forth. But at its heart, that's what we're measuring. So we measure those two things independently. And this comes back to part of Justin's question of we can measure both independently, so we can draw lessons for our future testing program from the pure CRO result or the pure SEO result. But then we do try and combine them. And what we're trying to do when we combine them is, as I said earlier, that we bear in mind that the conversion rate applies to all visitors from every channel, with some asterisks. Obviously, different channels have different conversion rates. And that but obviously the SEO uplift only improves the number of visitors from organic search. So I don't quite know if I've answered your question there, Brianna. Feel free to drop back in with a thread or another question, if not. Okay, Jose, I'm curious, how do you determine success metrics for an SEO test? And how do you determine for how long to run the test, since the results are determined by a third party? And how different is the SEO test from a traditional CRO test? So I think hopefully I've answered the difference between the SEO test and the CRO test. Again, if not, feel free to drop more questions in. Success metrics. So in a pure SEO test, where we're not running it all the way through full funnel, we are typically judging success on number of visitors from organic search to the pages in question. And the reason that we pick that metric is it's kind of the right amount close to the business for most of these tests. So if you imagine something like the example I gave, where we're changing the title to include the price, we're hoping that we can just get more visitors to that page. Now, if we were to have our success metric of being improved click-through rate or improved rankings, we would potentially miss out on other benefits, right? Because you might improve click-through rate and improve rankings. So it can't just be measured on those kinds of things. And that's why we measure traffic. It is complex to measure because other things affect traffic at the same time. There's seasonality going on, there's Google algorithm updates, competitor actions, all this kind of stuff. This is why we have a control group to compare against. But if we try and measure the benefit of the change all the way through to conversions, we have two problems. We have the sample rate mismatch issue that I mentioned earlier, but also conversions are just too sparse. So we need a winning measurement that is much higher volume so that we can run these tests across a long tail of pages. And I've written more about that. After this, I can drop in a link as to why that's our success metric. So we focus primarily as the success metric on organic traffic, but we have metrics in both directions. So we have the explanatory metrics that I mentioned before, click-through rates, ranking changes, and we have the business metrics in the full funnel analysis to say, okay, but let's make sure, in this example here, let's make sure that we didn't just get a load of unconverting traffic. We obviously want to make sure that folks are still buying from us. As far as the how long to run for, we've built out a model that is it's a Bayesian model, and so it has its own stopping criteria. built in. So we are typically, and we say our rule of thumb is don't run any test for less than a week, even if it looks like it's coming out conclusive, unless it's catastrophically bad, in which case do some sense checking and make sure you haven't kind of completely tanked rankings and everything else. But if it's kind of middling to positive, then keep it running for at least a week, but then essentially when it reaches statistical significance based on the Bayesian bootstrapping, that's how we do it. Question from Oliver: how do we stop Google crawling directly to the origin server that they can skip the CDN and go direct to the origin? The short answer is, if you set it up correctly, they can't do that. So the way that, where have I got the, somewhere, I've got the thing that shows, oh yeah, this one. So what you would do is you would typically have your origin only accept requests from the CDN, or in this case, from Search Pilot, in the stack, and you wouldn't allow direct connections into the origin. And you can block that by either IP address or other forms of authentication. But you would typically lock that down, and you would do that whether Search Pilot is in the mix or not. So having as soon as you have a CDN, best practice is to say only allow requests to come in through the CDN. Don't allow direct requests to the origin server unless they're from trusted, your engineers' machines and so forth. Yeah, observation from Justin that's good. We can talk more. I'll come back into the Slack later, and we can chat about some of these kind of things. Do we see Google's another question from Brianna, do we see Google's constantly changing search engine results pages as a challenge or a benefit to SEO testing? Great question. I definitely see it as a benefit to SEO generally. So when I was a consultant, we used to have a saying that Google changing things was the source of our job security. Because when Google changes stuff, our clients always needed to know how to respond, what to do differently, and so forth. In the SEO testing world, I see it as a bit more neutral, I suppose. I think we do sometimes, Google will announce something or we'll notice something, and we will rerun some old tests quite often. So we had a good example of this recently. Google really dialed back or made it much harder to get FAQ listings in the search results. So when they first released FAQ schema markup, FAQs were everywhere. And then they really dialed that back and said, no, we're only going to put it on like pages that are actually really FAQ pages. And we'd had some big wins from adding FAQ schema markup on certain pages. And we had a number of our customers go back and retest that and say, or test the inverse, this thing that used to be positive, if we remove it, do we get a drop, or is this now redundant technology? So yeah, probably a little bit of job security, but for the most part, I'm in favor of it just because they're trying to do their job better and better. And the better Google is for users, the more opportunity that I feel like we really benefit as search as a whole grows and improves, and that's kind of what they're doing there.
Last
Possibly,
question.
I was going to say final question, which is good because I think it's the last question we have in here, is another one from Oliver. If we increase one page in your B group and it links to a page in your A group, doesn't it impact both pages? So that is definitely true for an internal linking test. And that's, we have two approaches to this. One is to say, so quite often, it's hard to explain. This is why I've given a whole other presentation that I've linked to, which is probably worth you checking out if you're really interested in this. The short answer is sometimes we try and make sure we don't do that, so that we are running on almost kind of two silos. So these pages never link to these pages. They just like link between themselves. This is a really bad like visualization. So we've run some tests that are siloed like that. More commonly, we run tests with a measurement section, which is essentially the set of all pages getting new links to them. And so you have a test section, which is the pages that are changing, the pages whose HTML is changing. And then you have a measurement section, which is the pages that are getting new links pointed to them. And the maths gets complicated again, but that's kind of the idea behind it. The only different perspective I would give to that, or I think maybe you've understood this, but it's only really internal linking tests where that's a problem. When we're talking about what I call a regular SEO test, right, a kind of changing the text on the page or changing the meta information, typically the impact is limited to that page itself. And so we don't have to worry too much about this kind of cascading effect. Anchor text is possibly another muddy gray area in there. I can geek out about this all day, but
Clearly.
we've probably come to the end of the session. So everybody else is like, this is getting boring, Will. Time to shut up.
This has not been boring. This has been so amazing. I got to hear you talk. I think it was almost 6 years ago now, and you opened my eyes and mind to the possibilities of SEO testing. And I have been wanting so much to have you on the TLC since then to open everyone else's eyes and minds to the possibility. And I'm so glad we finally made this happen. Thank you so much, Will. This has been so wonderful. And I can't wait for you to now dive in and start answering even more questions on the TLC.
I will. And I'll drop some links.
There's going to be so much more conversation. So
I will definitely drop some links in there as well, because that's obviously
yes,
easy to do in Slack while we're speaking. I'll share the
yes,
slides in there. Would you like me to do that as well? I can share.
yes, please, please. If you're willing to do so, I think everybody's going to want to click some of those links and share whatever you're willing to share as far as content. Obviously, there's more questions. Thank you so much, Will. And let me remind everybody really quick, next conversation is with Daphne, co-founder of Women in Experimentation. She'll be here April 19th, talking about why experimentation is like making lemonade. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you again, Will, for staying just a little bit long. Thank you all.
On Slack. Take care.
Bye-bye.